Okay, welcome back, everyone. If I could ask our panel one panelists to turn their cameras on, we'll get started. Good morning, everyone. So welcome back to those who were with us in the first session. For those who missed it, my name is Anneke Smit, and I'm the director of the Windsor Law Center for Cities and associate professor at Windsor Law. A big shout out once again to our summit partners, the School of Cities at the University of Toronto, the Smart Prosperity Institute at the University of Ottawa, and the Canadian Urban Institute. As well as our other sponsors, City Building Ryerson, the Windsor Regional Society of Architects, and LGA Architects. This is session one entitled The Housing Crisis in a Systems Context. In this session, I am joined by some of the experts who are best placed to give us context for the rest of our discussion over the next 2 days. First of all, how bad is the housing crisis? Who's most affected and where is the crisis headed? And we are thrilled to have Dr. Mike Moffat from the Smart Prosperity Institute, who has all of that data, all of that context, and he's going to start us off in a minute with that conversation. And then the systems approach. Among the chief characteristics of a healthy functioning system are balance and inclusion. In recognizing the need for more housing, we need to address the issues that directly intersect with housing as key informants of policy and direction. We heard from Minister Hussain in the first session about all the investment that's taking place. How do we do that? How do we create housing policy and fund housing construction in a way that allows us to keep the systems approach in mind? Climate, equity, municipal finance all need to be considered when creating housing policy at all three levels of government. But how do we do that? In this session, as I say, we're joined by some of the people best placed to do that work for us. We will be placing bios in the chat, so we're not going to do a deep dive into people's bios here. They speak for themselves in any case, but if you need a background, you'll have that in a moment in the chat. But I'll just introduce them quickly. First of all, Dallas Alderson is Director of Public Affairs and Policy, Cooperative Housing Federation of Canada. Good morning, Dallas, and welcome. Miranda Baksh is CEO of the Peel Community Climate Council and Digital Engagement Senior Coordinator with Environmental Defense. I've had the opportunity of working with Miranda on a number of projects through our Cities and Climate Action Policy Clinic. She is, speaking of a force, she is a force to be reckoned with. She's a winner of all kinds of awards, a leader beyond her years, and thrilled to have her with us. I will just note that Miranda, like all of us and all of you, has a busy schedule and it was already tied up with the meeting coming later, so she will have to slip out at some point, but we're grateful to her for being here for what she can. Rena Bordelin, Councillor of Ward 3 and the Chair of the Windsor Development and Heritage Standing Committee in the City of Windsor. Second term Councillor, welcome to Councillor Bordelin. And then Michael Cook, who I'm proud to say is also a Windsor Law grad, among other things. Welcome to Michael, land use planning and development lawyer with Blake Castles in Graydon and a member of the Black Planners and Urbanists Association. Welcome to all of you. We'll do a couple of rounds of questions after Mike's initial opening, and then we will turn it over to audience questions as well. So Mike, to you for starters. Set the stage for us. How bad is the housing crisis? Who's it affecting? Is it going to get worse before it gets better? What else do we need to know?
Yeah, well, and I think that I could probably spend 2 days on. So I'm going to instead, I'm going to lay out in a few minutes just a few sort of data points to get us started. So we've all seen graphs that look like this as far as, market rate housing goes. So I'm originally from London, Ontario, so I decided to look at London St. Thomas market for single family benchmark. But across Canada, we see these kind of hockey stick shaped graphs when it comes to housing and house prices. I actually think the graphs are more useful if instead of looking at what the absolute price is, instead we look at how much did price increase over the previous year. So year over year increase. So for London, you get something that looks like this, that basically for about 15 years, house prices go up a few $1,000s a year, and then something changes around 2016. And this is going to be different for different markets in Canada. The exact date is going to differ a little bit, but you get something that looks like this. That in 2016, the market really starts to change. And then finally, during the pandemic, everything just blows up. So I guess the question here is, what the heck is going on? So, I can summarize, you had a decade where prices were in London were going up about $6,000 a year. Then you had 4 years where they're going up $42,000 a year, which is a lot if you think about it. Like, for a lot of people, their house was earning more than they were. And then finally, over the last 24 months, year over year prices are in London going up, over $100,000 a year. And that is not unique to London. So we can basically, across Canada, look at the housing market in 4 periods during this century: a stability era, a population growth era, a pandemic era, and then coming up a post-pandemic era. So why did everything turn weird in Southern Ontario around 2014, 2016? And the short answer is population growth. That, Ontario's population had been growing consistently by about 120,000 people a year. That changed almost overnight, partly due to changes in immigration policy, partly due to changes in international student policy, but also after the oil price crashed, Ontario became a more attractive destination for workers than the prairie provinces in Newfoundland, which earlier in the century had been a bigger destination. The problem is, particularly in the GTA, we didn't really change, and we can get into reasons why, but we really didn't change the rate at which we were building housing. So on the left side, we have housing completions for 2011 to 16. On the right side, it's 2016 to 21. And I assure you that these graphs are different, but you need a magnifying glass to note any differences in that. So particularly in the GTA, we saw not that much change to housing completions, despite the fact that population growth rates had gone up by about 60%. So what this caused was a mass exodus of families, particularly young families, looking for housing. So this is the level of population growth for Ontario, excluding Toronto and Peel. And it pretty much doubled overnight between 2015 and 16, because families were looking for a place to raise their kids. So, and oftentimes they're coming to Windsor, they're coming to London, Kitchener-Waterloo, to Ottawa, and so on. So then what happened during the pandemic? Because we know during the pandemic, population growth hasn't actually gone up all that much. So it's actually a different set of dynamics going on in the last 24 months. What we've seen during the pandemic is record low interest rates. We've seen white collar professionals who've done financially very well during the pandemic. They're not going on vacation. They're not buying new cars. They're not commuting. They're saving a bunch of money, and they're oftentimes throwing that into the real estate market. And part of that is an investment, but part of it is often people wanting more space. If you're going to be on Zoom all day, I want maybe a bigger backyard and I want to be closer to nature. And oftentimes they're not selling their existing smaller home. So they're like, okay, I'm going to keep my smaller house in Toronto, but I'm also going to buy this property in Bobcaygeon. So you've got a lot of people buying and not that many people wanting to sell. And then as prices go up, you get this fear of missing out effect where people go, okay, well, I got to get into the market now, because if I wait 6 months, prices are going to be even higher. So, high prices beget high prices beget high prices. So then what happens next is anyone's guess. That, we should expect that some of the pressure will be taken off due to higher interest rates. And as the pandemic ends, I expect a lot of those families who have dual properties to sell one of them. And I think one of the big questions is, which one do they sell? Did they keep the house in Bobcaygeon, or did they keep the house in Toronto? So we're going to see a lot of volatility over the next few years. But I would suggest that demographic change, high rates of population growth are, the long run trend is to more and more demand, even if in the short and medium term, we have a lot of volatility. So I know there's all kinds of things I didn't discuss there. I didn't discuss non-market rate housing in different parts of the country, but we would be here all day. But that is kind of an example of what we're seeing across the country. The dates differ, the dollar amounts differ, but it's that same basic pre-pandemic and pandemic trend.
Perfect. Thank you so much, Mike. And we'll come back to lots of that, I think, as we go along, and there may be other questions from the audience as we go as well. I see questions coming in the chat already to our attendees. Please feel free to throw the questions in there, and we'll come to audience questions in a few moments. For the panelists now, the rest of the panelists, you've heard an outline from Mike about some of the pressures and where we're at. You've heard from the minister. we've talked about the need for a systems approach to all of this, and all of you have a deep knowledge of one or more of the pieces of that system, of the lens that we need to be moving forward with. So my question to all of you to start things off, and Miranda, just for time, I'm going to go to you first, is what does a systems approach to housing look like for you, sitting where you are, and the involvement that you have in the housing sector, and how it intersects with your other expertise, so the other involvements that you have at the municipal level in particular. Miranda.
Sure. Well, thank you so much for having me, and just wanted to speak on some positionality of where I am sitting. I'm on the territory of the Anishinaabe, Huron-Wendat, Haudenosaunee, and Mississaugas of the Credit First Nation, also known as Brampton, Ontario, so in Peel region. And when I think about healthy functioning systems and the housing crisis and development, we really do need to define how we are framing the word development, and recognize that, yes, there is a need for more housing, but there's also a need for a more stable climate. And when we think about urban sprawl, of course, that directly relates to biodiversity loss of land that keeps our climate in a healthy balance, and just climate's livable. And so urban sprawl, obviously, as we know, it replaces farms and forests that provide us with local clean air. And, you know, where I am, it's a very car dependent area. I am at the cusp of sprawl, like just one intersection down, it's all farmland. And then if I look that way, it's all suburbia. And so it's something that I completely understand where I've grown up. And it's very common for me to see farms that I've grown up near just disappearing year after year. And it's just something that you kind of get used to. And it's really heartbreaking, especially when we know how much carbon is sequestered within the land, and how important the type of soil that we have here in Southern Ontario is for our food systems. And so, you know, I could just share a quick story. Just 3 weeks ago, there was a significant flooding that happened here in Brampton. 100 homes were evacuated. Some residents were rescued by boat. And that is simply due to urban sprawl. There was nowhere for all of the snow melt and rainfall that we had to go. And there were very serious consequences. So it's a lived reality that many of us in marginalized and racialized communities see. And this is already happening. And so when we think about the future and how we design urban spaces, it's something we absolutely need to take into account, especially knowing that winters are getting warmer, and this will become more of a norm moving forward. So yeah, that is definitely just one aspect of the area that I'm living in specifically. But another context is thinking about the Highway 413 that's going to be developing over the Greenbelt, and a lot of protected land and farmland here in Peel. So we think about Bolton and areas of Brampton as well. In fact, Ontario's Greenbelt watersheds provide more than $1 billion worth of ecological services. So keeping it intact is actually much more in our interest than developing or paving over it, especially for redundant highways. And so it's really tough when we think about highway development that will only perpetuate more urban sprawl in northern areas. And investments will continue, and we're really just continuing the cycle of inaffordable housing and unsustainable communities, when it's so important for us to do the opposite. We really don't have time to waste with the climate crisis that we're in.
Thanks so much for that, Miranda. And I'm going to come back to you for some concrete suggestions, time permitting, your time permitting. But thanks for laying that out for us. Dallas, can I go to you next?
Sure, yes. Thanks. It's great to be here today. I just wanted to acknowledge before I offer some comments. I'm joining you from the traditional unceded territory of the Algonquin Anishinaabe people, also known as Ottawa-Gatineau. I'm on the Gatineau side. Yeah, a few thoughts on these really important questions, and just really pleased to offer some perspective, and in particular appreciate that Dr. Moffat's sort of open the door to talking about some non-market housing needs as well, because from my perspective, certainly a systems approach to addressing housing from a supply lens needs to be inclusive of all needs and income levels, and that, you know, really by definition means both an acceleration of market housing supply, but also non-market housing supply. So housing provided by cooperatives and nonprofits. So some context there is really interesting. In the last couple decades, you know, we see very clearly this really significant gulf between supply and demand. And so in that way, we can't depend anymore, as we partly did, we never fully did previously, but partly depend on a bit of a filtering process to improve the housing situation of low and even moderate income Canadians in market-based housing. So in past decades, we saw market rental housing become less expensive over time, and it became therefore a relatively affordable option for many households, but this really isn't happening anymore. So now that this kind of housing is such a significant investment opportunity, whether that's for individuals, corporations, for REITs, this sort of housing is being snapped up in order to increase rent levels, because there's the ability to capture those higher rent levels where there's just not sufficient demand. So we have this process of what we talk about as the erosion of naturally occurring affordable housing. And just to maybe throw out a couple numbers here to illustrate this point, and this is citing the work of Steve Pomeroy, who's a housing researcher based in Ottawa. He's calculated that between 2011 and 2016, the number of private rental units affordable to households earning less than $30,000 per year declined by more than 320,000 units. And this is a really important segment of the population, right? Almost 18% of households in 2016 in that period had a household income of less than $30,000. So, we can't really expect just increasing the supply of market housing to meet the needs of those households. So, we need to do a couple things. We need to, of course, build more non-market housing, so cooperative and nonprofit housing, but we also need to facilitate the acquisition of some of that existing market rental housing to get it into nonprofit and co-op hands. So was appreciative of the minister's comment on this point, but and the intention here is really to bake in permanent affordability. And we need to do this in a way that's accelerated and really, happening in lockstep with the construction of new units. I'll leave you with maybe just one small statistic around, what we've seen over time, the drop in the construction of cooperative homes in particular. Co-ops and nonprofits are both really important in the non-market supply. But we had significant rates of co-op construction in the 70s and 80s. In 82, 8% of all rental homes constructed in Canada were cooperatives, totaling more than 6,500 units. In 2020, less than 1% of all rental homes constructed were co-ops. So, we really don't have, or we haven't really been able to meet demand there either. So there's a number of things to tackle on the non-market side if we're taking a broader systems approach. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Dallas, for that. I'm going to come back to your suggestions and some questions for you shortly as well. Michael, I'm going to go to you next. So Michael, you're wearing a couple of hats here. One is that you're a land use lawyer, so your sort of day job is there. And also I know as part of that, and you sit as a member of the Black Planners and Urbanists Association, which is one of the organizations that has published or submitted a public response to the Ontario Housing Tables report on housing affordability. So I'm hoping you can share some of your reflections from both of those perspectives.
Sure. So, I think just generally when we're talking about a systems-based approach, we're talking about different, parts of that system working together. And I think all too often there is a conflict between the various levels of government when it comes to planning and development, and they're not often or not working enough together, particularly between, I think, the province and municipalities. I think some of that is just a natural tension between the province and municipalities. People often talk about municipalities being a creature of the province. So I think part of it's sort of naturally baked into the system, but a big part of it is also just politics. There's too much politics involved in planning. And, a large part of that is based on the fact that we listen to our communities when it comes to planning for development, but I think we listen too often or elevate the wrong voices in our communities. And too often we're listening to the constituents who are the loudest, and often those who are the loudest aren't in need of housing. They're not representative of the communities in need, but they have the loudest voices, and as a result, their wants and desires take precedence over those who are actually and really in need of housing. So I think what we need to do is elevate the voices of those people who aren't often at the table, who aren't the first to arrive at the community consultation meeting, and who often don't arrive unless there's specific outreach to them. And I think, oddly enough, those who aren't in need of housing, oftentimes, and I should step back, in my work, I'm often on the other side of the table from the community groups. Most of my work is for the big bad developer, and there's always that tension between the developer and the community. But I often hear people say, I've lived here for 30 years and I've raised my family here, and they don't want change. And it's understandable. I get that. Nobody wants, new development, towering over their neighborhood when they've been there for so long. But it's also because they don't need anywhere to go. And they've probably paid off their mortgages. And if they haven't, they're probably on the way to doing that. And so I think we need to elevate the voices of those who are most in need, and it's not happening enough. I think there is a recognition that it needs to happen more often, but I think what you will find is those who are most in need of housing aren't going to be so adamantly opposed to change. We need to make sure that when you're talking about developing areas that have traditionally been home to lower income and particularly ethnic communities, that we're not pushing those communities out. But I think you will find that most times those communities will welcome growth in their communities and welcome change, so long as it's respectful to their needs and desires. But they're not going to be the people who are opposed to any amount of intensification and just simply quite, and I hate to use the word, but NIMBYs. So that's what I think is one of the most important things we can do is just elevate those voices. And that was a big part of the Black Planners and Urbanist Association's submission to the province. And I also briefly mentioned we were invited by one of the members of the province's task force to make a submission, and so we did, and we outlined what we thought the barriers to more housing were, and how we can overcome those barriers. Our recommendations, parts of those recommendations were picked up, and others weren't. I think generally we were supportive of the province's recommendations, but I don't think that they went far enough in addressing the underlying problems. It was purely a let's cut red tape and increase supply, and there was a bit of trampling over the community consultation process, which again, it has its problems, but I don't think we need to completely disregard it. I think we need to elevate the voices of different communities than we currently do within that community consultation process.
Thank you so much, Michael. And there's a lot there that I want to come back to. I'm really glad that you raised all of that, and you've given us some really important context. I suspect that Councillor Bordelin will have comments on that as well from the municipal context, but I want to ask first of all in this first round, the other piece we don't have on the table is the municipal finance piece, and that's a lens we want to be bringing through all of our conversations today. So Councillor Bordelin, I'm going to ask you to respond to that first of all, and then maybe we'll come back to some of the other comments about consultation and inclusion.
Definitely, thank you. And really honored to be here today. I think this is probably one of the most important conversations happening in the country, because we have to see the approach, and I'm glad, I think everybody has actually mentioned municipal systems, and it's interesting, even Minister Hussein gave a shout out to municipalities, although oftentimes it's usually to blame us for things. So it's where the buck stops, and it's always the municipal governments that have to enact this policy. So what we have to be careful of, though, is that what we often hear, and with all due respect to our provincial and federal counterparts, is a deflection to the local municipalities. And yet those levels of government, give us from taxation barely any minimal dollars, and everything comes in these envelopes. You even heard Mr. Hussein said, we have an envelope for this, an envelope for that. And that's part of the problem. When we hear the things about cutting red tape, for example, when programs are tied to outcomes individually, that means a municipality has to apply for a program for flood mitigation strategies for climate action. Then they have to apply for a program for affordable housing. And then they have to apply for all these other types of programs for infrastructure. We should be working with the municipalities to create an official plan. And this also brings in the consultation piece. Create that official plan by listening to all the voices in the community, elevate those voices to actually create the checklist and the necessary changes that we want to see from the provincial and federal levels, and then give us direct perpetual funding to fund those projects. Because without that, what you're doing is you're actually creating a system where municipalities are then forced to look elsewhere. And what we've seen is that addiction to sprawl happening across Ontario for easy taxation dollars today, and deferring the infrastructure deficit and the infrastructure investments that need to happen in the next generation. And so because of that, we've seen how sprawl has become synonymous and understanding with something that is not sustainable financially. But the way in the system and the way that some of these programs are allowing municipalities to be funding, we look for the low-hanging fruit. And low-hanging fruit is to allow suburban sprawl to just happen because it brings us more taxation today. If our official plans mimic the type of density, the type of transit-oriented development, the type of development that doesn't create flooding in our municipalities, the type of developments that have affordable housing baked into them, if we create our official plans that check off all of those boxes, and that do all the necessary things, like changing zoning ordinances, like changing our planning procedures, like eliminating the red tape and politicians' interaction on the planning process. If we allow that all to happen in a natural way, we need it to be funded, and we need it to be funded steadily and perpetually. And there has to be policy change at the other levels as well. The federal government can easily work towards implementing, a tax on non-primary residences, and then that tax and those tax dollars get diverted to the municipalities to help deal with the housing situation. And that's just one example of how policy change has to happen at the federal and provincial levels as well, because the provincial recommendations, while a robust and a good view of the planning process and the investment process, it really came from the angle and from the perspective of developers who want to get their shovels in the ground quicker, which is one part of the equation. But as Minister Hussein mentioned, we have to actually look at the outcomes, not just how fast we can get shovels in the ground, but what are the outcomes of those projects? Are those projects costing municipalities money in the long run, or are those projects helping to invest in areas that then benefit from that density? So there has to be a good balance, and we need to be very careful of how easily we whip out the idea of Nimbyism, because Nimbyism does exist. I sit on the planning committee. I hear it every single month in order from every single issue that comes up. But to Michael's point, we need to be careful of understanding by elevating other people's voices, we don't have to quiet the other residents' voices. So everybody should have a voice in the planning of their community. But what we have to remember is that inherently in planning is that we're planning for future residents. So the voices of those residents can't be heard because we haven't actually, been able to house them and to welcome them into our neighborhoods. So that's the key element. And if you do all that at a municipal level, the federal and provincial dollars should flow and reward that type of official plan and that type of planning that works all of those intersections of climate, of infrastructure dollars, of density bonusing, of transit-oriented development. All of those things can work in concert.
Thank you so much. And actually this works really well because I'm going to go right back to Miranda, and it's, that sort of intersection of climate and finance that both push us back towards the densification piece is always so striking for very different reasons, compelling to different people for different reasons, but leading us to some of the same outcomes. Miranda, thank you for sticking with us for a bit longer. When you look at approaches to housing and to housing provision right now, and you sort of see the conversation and the way we talk about housing as a system or not in Canada right now, the housing crisis, from the climate perspective that you know so well, what's the biggest gap that you see? What's the place where you see these conversations happening and just thinking this X is missing, and how do we put that back in?
Yeah, I think it just kind of really echoes what Michael and Rena have been saying, like really that inclusion of voices that have been excluded in these conversations. And it is so important. And that's really what's missing. Like, I think once we have more of that, more diverse voices, more immigrants and newcomer voices, more youth voices, which is something we advocate for at the Community Climate Council. It's so important. And when I say youth, I really do mean anyone under 30. And ultimately, we are going to be the ones who are shaping the futures of these communities. And so our voices are so important to take into account. And also our ideas of sustainability are shifting. Our ideas of progress and development are shifting. They aren't the same as what we're seeing with urban sprawl. That's not what we define it as anymore. And so I think it's really important to take that into account. And I'd love to just share a quick example of the community that I'm living in. A lot of areas that are like newly developed on farmland. While it is contributing to urban sprawl, I'm noticing a huge difference in how they're developing. And it is a lot more sustainable. There's a lot more condominiums, so they're building upward instead of outward. There are really safe and accessible bike lanes, a lot more denser amenities so that people can actually commute on their bikes to get there. And of course, as I mentioned, there's more immigrants and newcomers who may not have access to a vehicle. And so there's affordable transit that's readily available, and many of which in Brampton are fully electric now. So it's really great to see that things are heading in that direction. But we really do need to incorporate more of that in our design and planning in the future. So yeah, ultimately, I do think that just in a nutshell, my answer would be inclusion of those voices, as mentioned before, is something that's definitely missing, because I do think we are on track in at least thinking about the climate context and sustainable development, but we just need to do so even more.
Thanks so much for that. And just wondered too, I mean, we saw maybe pre-pandemic in particular, but a wave of climate emergency declarations being declared across Canadian municipalities, several hundred, if I remember correctly, in particular, sort of through 2019, I think was maybe the high watermark there. And I don't know whether in your work at the moment, both with the Community Climate Council and with environmental defense, how much of this you see, but I'm wondering whether what your sense is of what kind of impact those climate emergency declarations is having on municipalities taking a climate lens to the other big issues they're facing, like the housing crisis.
I think it's definitely a tough one to answer. And I mean, in 2019, I was a part of the delegation at the Region of Peel in support of passing their climate change master plan. And I remember that moment so much. I remember feeling so hopeful. And now we're a few years in, and I don't know if I feel as hopeful. It really, there's so many great things that go into planning and these proposals and these plans, but then to actually see it into action, or who is prioritizing what goes into action, is really it shifts. And of course, understandably, with the pandemic, priorities have shifted. But whether there's transparency on whether the plan is being adapted or if it needs to be revisited is unclear. And again, those community consultations are really important to have these types of conversations. To also have experts and scientists in the room to say, hey, what you're actually proposing is or is not feasible. These targets can or cannot be met. I think those touch-based meetings are like so important to really make transparent to everyone. And, you know, it really does go to many different parts of the climate plans that have gone out. So when we think about sprawl, it actually makes energy bills and fuel costs more expensive. It contributes to pollution. You know, the homes that are being developed need more cooling and heating. And of course, we're all dependent on our vehicles here. And so driving burns more gas. And it really destroys our ability to feed ourselves, which is something that I touched upon earlier as well when thinking about agriculture. So it really does encompass a lot of aspects of all climate plans. This really isn't just housing, and it can't be seen as a separate entity that is disconnected from all the others, which is why the systems thinking is so important here.
Thanks so much for that. Yeah, and I think some of the work that my students have done through our Cities and Climate Action Policy Clinic, we've seen a lot of what you're talking about, and I've been struck by the disconnect often between the land use planning process at municipalities, and Councillor Borderland, you might want to comment on this as well, but the sort of disconnect between what's happening at a climate level or the sort of climate staffing and climate framework, and then the land use planning piece often seem to be quite separate. And I think just the lack of teeth often given to climate, obviously to climate emergency declarations, but even to climate planning more broadly. The size of the sort of staffing on climate obviously is a question, but so is the decision-making framework. And one really positive step we've seen in the city of Windsor is a climate risk analysis now being incorporated into administrative reports, and that came as a result of the plan to implement the climate emergency declaration. So I think that's a really strong sort of best practice that we're seeing. Still early days, but it at least requires now council to have that information in front of them when they're making decisions on every question, not just the ones that we would sort of traditionally call climate. But I think, reporting measures, thinking about carbon budgets, I mean, all of those tools are out there and have had some take up, but I think still limited in Canada. I'll just give a shout out as well to C4C cities, who I think have done a lot of work on this in the international context, but including in Canada, on some of those tools as well. I don't know if there's anything else you want to respond to there, Miranda.
Yeah, very quickly, I just thought about the climate emergency itself, and it reminded me of how it was declared also at the Region of Peel, just very quickly. I do remember that, just seeing our leaders, our mayors, it was really exciting in a way as a youth to see, okay, these are the people in charge of our future. Let's see what's going to happen. And there was a discussion like, oh, the city of Mississauga declared an emergency. Maybe we should just declare an emergency as well. Yeah. And then they all voted and it was passed and it's an emergency. And I was shocked. There was no scientist in the room. There were no targets set. And so, yes, I just wanted to paint that context out for anyone listening. It's really important that we take action when we say that there's an emergency. We don't just declare it to declare it. Just wanted to put it out there.
And I think a lot of the questions raised, I mean, if that climate emergency is there, then presumably that comes into the housing plan and everything else, right, as a critical lens. Dallas, let me go to you next. When you look at or sort of think about housing from a systems perspective, what's the sort of key piece that you see? You've painted a picture of sort of where we've moved away from too many of the initiatives that were more prevalent in our housing system and what we built in past decades. What's the one sort of key thing that you'd like to see changed in the way we're approaching housing from a systems perspective at the moment?
Sure, maybe I'll highlight two things. I think one, like at a high level, we developed a lot of amazing housing cooperatives across the country from the 60s through to the early 90s, when there was robust federal funding in place to do that. Typically, those buildings, those co-ops are small. Some of them are high rises for sure, but generally speaking, it's tricky for then those individual co-ops to proactively seek out and really have the capacity and leverage points to participate in new development. So I think a different way of funding new cooperative communities would be something that recognizes the importance of scale, uses maybe a portfolio approach rather than relying on individual co-ops who are really good at operating their buildings, right, running their communities, making sure that works. If they're really good at that, they're not necessarily development experts. So how can we put in place funding mechanisms that sort of correct for some of the lessons that we've learned in scale and really meets co-ops where they are? So I'd offer that at kind of a high level. And then maybe a more specific example that I think speaks to some of the themes of this event in terms of climate action and inclusion of the development opportunity that I think we have in terms of growing co-op housing. One in particular that I think would meet a lot of objectives is development and infill of certain kinds of co-op housing communities. So you've probably seen this in the Windsor area, because I know some of this exists and it does across the country too. But some of the co-ops that were developed over time are these, relatively low-level homes. So they're connected towns or they're stacked town style developments, and they have a lot of potential from a redevelopment and infill perspective, which is good on a number of fronts. So obviously, densification is an important climate action strategy, but also in terms of who lives in some of those co-op housing communities, there's so many original or long-time members, and they moved in when their kids were young, a lot of single parents, and they've stayed, right? Because these are their communities and because these are affordable places to live. Their kids have grown up. There's a lot of empty nesters, but they're in these 2 or 3 bedroom units because that's all that exists in the co-op. So you redevelop, you can put in a number of 1-bedroom units. A lot of these kinds of developments have pretty big parking lots. There's a bunch of options that would allow densification, but for the purpose of facilitating kind of aging in place for some of those long-time co-op members, and then you free up, this really beautiful outcome. You free up family-size rental housing, and that is a huge need. So multiple objectives can be met in that part of a future of co-op housing development.
Thank you so much. Actually, I'm going to just jump over to Mike for a second. Mike, is there anything that you're hearing here that you'd like to respond to?
Yeah, I actually want to push back a little bit on this idea that, we need to listen to more voices. And I'm going to give you 3 scenarios. Okay, suppose, and I'm full disclosure, I'm an existing homeowner. If I want to tear down my house tomorrow and build a gaudy McMansion, which is completely out of the style of the neighborhood, as long as I conform to setback rules and things like that, I can do that and nobody can stop me. Second scenario, I want to tear down my house and build something that is actually in the style of the neighborhood, but I want to build a triplex. I want to have a couple of units to house family members and maybe sell them off. Then essentially, all of my neighbors get a veto on that. Third scenario, I'm not going to talk about houses now. I'm going to say, let's suppose instead, I'm having a midlife crisis. I just turned 45, and I want to buy a giant gas guzzling truck, one of the ones that are up really high with no visibility, kills the planet, and actually increases the child mortality risk of my neighbors around me. Nobody can stop me. Because we sort of recognize that, if you want to sort of ban those trucks, doing so at a neighborhood level is not the appropriate way to go about it. Instead, you should be dealing with higher levels of government. So I really think we need to rethink the line on where do neighborhoods get sort of a veto, and where do we say, this is your right as sort of a property owner? Because it doesn't make any sense to me that, my neighbors could veto me building a duplex or triplex and actually help address the housing crisis. But if I want to buy a giant truck, which puts their kids at risk, go for it. I think there's a lot of path dependency here. And I don't think we've really sort of thought out, again, where is it appropriate for people to say, okay, yeah, no, this should or shouldn't be in our neighborhood, and where is it should be left to the individuals to make the choice? Because right now the way we do things just does not make any sense.
Okay, I want to hear from everyone on this. Michael, I'm going to go to you next, because my next question for you was, what are the ways in which we actually shift this conversation around and shift the way we do consultation? I agreed with you. When you look at the report coming from the housing panel and the suggestions about sort of reducing consultation, I completely understand where that's coming from. But at the same time, I think it puts the cart before the horse a little bit in terms of, if we back up one step and think about who votes, who's got the time to be a part of these conversations. And sort of even just, in a general sense, what the sort of low level of engagement at the municipal level is, I think that a lot of that was missing from that context. So let me go to you, and then Reno, I know you have comments as well there.
Yeah, I agree that perhaps there's too much consultation at times, but part of that is because of our unnecessarily restrictive zoning. And so, to Mike's point, if you want to, build some gaudy McMansion that complies with all the zoning bylaws, then fine. You don't need to engage in a public process because you meet the zoning requirements. You want to build a triplex, too bad, our restrictive zoning doesn't allow you to do that. So if you change the zoning to allow certain more built forms that we currently don't permit as of right, then you don't have to go through that public engagement process. And we've seen some really positive developments in that regard. Examples of where the province can empower municipalities to sort of push forward with things like garden suites. Changes to the Planning Act so that municipalities can implement new forms of housing that are unappealable. But but the process, unfortunately, the process of amending the municipalities' zoning bylaws are a public process as well. And so oftentimes what happens is those standard groups of people who have very strong feelings about this come out and impacts that process. So I can give you an example. In the city of Toronto a number of years ago, there was an amendment to the official plan that made changing the neighborhood character even more difficult. And so any sort of minor variant, any sort of minor variance application would need to consider the existing neighborhood character. And right now, the City of Toronto has just recently passed a garden suites bylaw amendment, and it was appealed by a group of resident associations, questionable whether they can even appeal it under the Planning Act, and notwithstanding whether or not they even have a right to appeal. I'm not sure the basis of their appeal is going to stand up, but so I think that absolutely we have perhaps too much public engagement, but it's the wrong type of engagement. I don't have an issue per se with allowing people at the local level to be involved in the process of shaping their communities. I think that's absolutely important. The problem is when it's not when it's intended, when that participation is intended to prevent change rather than produce positive change. And so I think that. So one of the things, just going back to the Black Planners and Urbanists Association, some of the ways we think that municipalities can address these planning challenges and restrictive zoning were to, number one, implement policies to protect Black-owned businesses and Black communities from commercial and residential displacement, identify and implement anti-displacement strategies that increase local housing supply while protecting and enhancing affordable housing. We suggested things like, sorry to just flip through my papers here, and engaging more effectively with renters to give voice to their needs, particularly Black households who are more likely to rent, increasing the representation and participation of low moderate income communities, and defining housing needs throughout the community planning process. But one of the things we did agree with was sort of this, a lot of talk about, the yellow belt in particular GTA communities, where you have these large swaths of low-rise residential neighborhoods that are, exclusive to detached forms of housing. And a big part of addressing, housing affordability and providing more affordable housing is opening up areas of lands that are currently zoned to exclude that type of housing. So that's and certainly would make my job a lot easier. I don't want to be tied up in appeals before the Ontario Land Tribunal all the time, arguing for what everybody agrees is good planning and forms through all the provincial policies, but you get tied up with all these outdated municipal bylaws that, even if they're not 30 years old, have been amended recently, giving too much weight to the wrong members of society.
Thanks so much, Michael. I'm going to go to you next, Reno, and I just want to do, while we're making that transition, a shout out for the session coming this afternoon at 1:30 to 3. One of the other questions is, what are the other tools to determine what we should be building are there out there? And we're going to be talking, Alex Bezikovic from the Architecture Critic from the Globe and Mail will be chairing that panel, moderating that panel. And the conversation will be around target market analysis and other tools that can be used by municipalities to figure out what should be built. And I think that's, that's a balance to this conversation here. Yes, voices are, and consultation is one piece of the puzzle. But when we're talking about sort of the public interest in a broader sense in moving forward on housing, there are other tools available to municipalities as well. Reno, go ahead.
Thanks. And so I think to Mike's comments and Michael's, honestly, I think we agree. When I say we need to elevate voices, it's really about what kind of process are we creating. Our process right now is complete garbage. It's set up, as Michael outlined, it's set up to basically be stopgaps for people to protect their property values. And that's the way in which the system is created. LPAT, OMB, whatever it's called now, is also an extra step in just wasting time. And that's where people then see the Nimbyism. But what the system does is it creates a process which elevates the voice of the NIMBYs so that people can point the fingers and say that that's the problem. The problem is we're asking the wrong people at the wrong point in the process. What we need is official plans that speak to the neighborhoods, even look at the process on some of those planning items. And this is provincial policy where notices go out to half a kilometer radius to the owners, even the language that's used. So if you live in the neighborhood, but you're renting, you don't actually have the same say as the owner who might live in another city or another country on what happens in your neighborhood. And then we start to think that, oh, these are people who are only the ones who own. And so then it becomes the affluent stopgap for them to control the property values in their neighborhoods. And I've heard all kinds of things, and all kinds of things that also leads to things like we don't want those people or those types of renters and things like that. The issue is we meet with people early. We meet with people in a broad public consultation in creating what is our official plan. Once you have that official plan and that's steeped in facts, in data, in building good neighborhoods, having good transit systems, if somebody wants to do something on their property, we have many laws and bylaws that actually controls what happens on people's properties. You don't want something left derelict because it reduces the neighborhood and causes issues in the neighborhood. To Michael's point, yes, like right now, you can build a McMansion and it could be more distasteful than a triplex. But if that's baked into the official plan and it's accepted by the province and by the feds and funded, then there is no public meeting at that point. And we're not going to talk about the style of brick, and we're not going to talk about whether the plaque for heritage goes above the door or next to the door. And we're not going to go to the LPAT because the plaque is a wrong bronze. So these are the types of things that exist today because the system is set up to fail. What we need is a broader consultation process to help communities create their official plans that take everything into account: equity, density. So to Mike's point earlier, communities, and this has now been proven. Halifax did a study in the early 2000s. Ottawa did one recently. When you're building, there is a level. Once you set your service level in your community, and that's your base tax, net value that you need to raise. The biggest influencer for how we raise that is actually residents per acre. We often think that, oh, I live in a McMansion, I pay a lot of tax. But what is your net contribution to the tax at that point? Because in Ottawa, what they found that in suburban sprawl, regardless of how big the house was and regardless of how much tax they were paying, it was actually costing the municipality roughly $495 a year to service that home. Whereas in the city or in the more dense areas, even though the property values are lower and the incomes are lower, the yield per acre was actually $606 net benefit. And so what you're seeing is that density is actually yielding the how we should be funding our municipalities. So when you make that official plan, if you want to be in an area that is very low density, very few people per acre, cul-de-sacs are notoriously long driveways that the municipality and the rest of the residents in the municipality take on to service, to replace, to plow the snow, all those things. if you create the plan and you build it in a way where it disincentivizes that and allows for that to be charged through development charges, through higher taxation rates, those types of things, and then you bonus density, you bonus development that's done within areas where there are transit area developments, and that's baked in from the get-go. And then you don't have to apply for one program here or one program there. The funding comes straight from the government, and there isn't 5 layers of public consultation afterwards. It happens early on. You make a broad public consultation. Once you set your official plan and you change your zoning bylaws and you change the ordinances to match your outcomes and your goals, that's it. Then there's no more opportunity for someone to come in ad hoc and say, I don't like that development. I don't like what they're doing there. I don't like what they're doing there, because that's what's happening today. And so, and I can tell you, as chair of the planning meeting, I hear it every single meeting, and I've heard all kinds of things. And so the issue is the process is flawed today. And so we have to entrench it in what those actual real costs are and what are the outcomes that we want.
Thanks so much. I'm going to go to Dallas in just a second for our last word on this. I just wanted to say that Radio-Canada put out a really interesting investigative report in the last couple of weeks on sprawl in Canadian cities. They looked at the last 20 years using AI, and it was pretty striking. You know, we talk about population growth, but the growth in the footprint of our cities is massively larger than population growth, with the result that almost every city in Canada is much less dense than it was 20 years ago. And again, from a climate perspective, that's the impacts are obvious, but also from a municipal finance perspective, the impacts are obvious. I hear that Rena, I can't remember if you mentioned it or not, the number I hear here is that the city of Windsor has a $1 billion infrastructure debt in terms of being able to service what we have right now, never mind what we're doing moving forward. And I don't think we're alone in that. That's a pattern we're seeing across the country. There are more parking spots per person per capita than there were 20 years ago in the cities that were studied. You know, all of those measures were headed in the wrong direction. So I think, you know, for all the reasons, it's important to have that data in front of us. But Dallas, just to close out that conversation on consultation, you're sitting in a place where Nimbyism is obviously a big consideration. You're working with communities that are probably historically less engaged at the municipal level than many. What's your take on where we're at on consultation and the inclusion of voices?
Yeah, I mean, I would just reinforce, so both on consultation and other regulatory pieces around zoning reform, you know, these are the prerequisites, right? If we're going to drive more non-market supply, and like the market is not going to build housing that's affordable for households earning less than $30,000 a year, right? So we need other ways to get that housing built. And co-ops and nonprofits as well are in an interesting opportunity because many have been built 25, 30 years ago. So they have some equity to put in. You know, they're certainly mission motivated. They're going to deliver permanently affordable housing. We still need some public funds to do that, which is sort of hard enough to achieve. But if the starting point is that you need to go through a public consultation process, you know, co-op members have seen this go offside in other circumstances. They're scared off from the get-go, right? And sort of similarly intimidated by thinking about going through a rezoning process, right? Which is sometimes what's needed. So these are two like foundational pieces that I think eliminate a lot of, maybe eliminate is a strong word, but it really puts off a lot of potential developments that could hit so many objectives, right? Affordability, inclusion, climate action. So yeah, just to reiterate, there's a really important non-market dimension to the public consultation and regulatory conversation.
Thank you so much. We have about 20 minutes left, and I'm going to turn to some questions from the audience that have been coming in. We may not get to everybody. Panelists, you're welcome to respond to any of them in writing if you want, but we'll try and pick up a few at least, and I'll sort of put these out to the group to anyone who would like to respond. I'm going to go first to a question from Nicholas Lemera, who's in Windsor. From my experience in the construction industry, I've almost always worked through projects that are built to the code minimum standards. Performance standards like Passive House or the Living Building Challenge are enabling huge reductions in the long-term costs to residents. The initial cost is higher, but we can be building net positive homes right now through proper investments. Can we imagine non-market housing built to those high standards that simultaneously manages our housing crisis and the climate crisis? How can we make this a reality? How do we get beyond the code minimums? I'll put that out to anyone.
I'll start and kick it off. And I think some of it starts with changing building code immediately, which happens at the provincial level, increasing, basically elevating those minimum standards, as you mentioned, and then incentivizing those builds even through partnerships and I think tomorrow's session that's going to be talking about TIFs and other types of financing, I think will be a perfect tool to talk about this. So tune into tomorrow morning segment because I think it'll be a great lead-in for a lot of these questions. What tools do municipalities have today to incentivize that? And to your point, any public institution, so any public dollars going to build houses, apartments, anything, whether it's through a municipal partnership, all should be setting those standards, setting emission or energy targets for their new builds and leading by example. So public dollars as well as matched with incentives, and you can use even municipal taxes to help create those financing incentives.
Thank you. Michael, do you want to jump in on this one?
No, it's okay. I was just looking through BPUA's submissions, and one of the things we recommended was amending the building code to lower construction costs, a bit more affordable, inclusive built forms while maintaining accessibility. And another one was, where did it go? Sorry, but just to know, one of the people who you have on a panel tomorrow is Cheryl Case, who is also involved with the Black Planners and Urbanists Association. And I think she will speak to this very issue because a lot of the ideas in terms of lowering costs and enabling not-for-profit builders to actually be able to participate in the process came from Cheryl, the work that Cheryl's done.
Perfect. Yeah, we're thrilled that Cheryl will be joining us tomorrow, and she brings private sector experience as well as a connection with the School of Cities at U of T right now. So that'll be great to have her on there as well. Thanks, Michael. Anyone else want to jump in on that question? Okay, let me throw another one at you then. This comes from Jeff Watson, who has a question about secondary dwelling units, and that's something that we'll hear a little bit more about as an example of the types of housing innovations that are taking place in the fourth panel tomorrow. But his question is, it says 3 of 8 municipalities in my county zone for second dwelling units. Why haven't the others been required by the province of Ontario to follow suit? And so maybe this sort of opens up a little bit of a conversation as well about, again, that question of provincial regulation and the role of the province in guiding municipalities here too. But I'll open that up to the panel for anyone who wants to jump in. And I think Dallas too, again, from an affordable housing perspective, I guess, what impact do you see this as having in terms of secondary dwelling or additional dwelling units being an actual sort of potential solution on affordable housing?
Yeah, so I'll jump on this, and I think it's vitally important that the province set minimum standards for municipalities, just because of all the sort of externalities involved. We have 444 municipalities across Ontario, and the issue is that what one does affects the other. Most of the housing demand that we've seen in Southwestern Ontario is coming from the GTA, and you just pick any community, let's say Stratford could do everything right on housing and it wouldn't matter one whit because it just creates more demand coming in from the GTA. So, it reminds me a lot of the climate change issue, right? Where you have all of these different jurisdictions, and that's why you need to have these, international agreements. I think, because again, what one jurisdiction does affects another, and you have all of these spillover effects. So I really do think that we need stronger minimum standards from the province, because otherwise you can do all the right things as a municipality, but you're just going to get more and more drive until you qualify families come in if the surrounding municipalities don't get their act together on housing.
Thanks. Anyone else wanted to jump in on that one?
I'll add to that voice, and I think Windsor's a perfect example of that, because we were one of the last municipalities, or one of the only municipalities that didn't get amalgamated with our neighboring suburban and small municipalities. So Windsor Essex is actually 8-9 technically smaller municipalities and so you can drive 5 minutes and get different zoning bylaws, different development charges, different land use planning principles. So if Windsor decided not to allow greenfield sprawl, they would literally drive 2 kilometers and be allowed to do it everywhere there. So to Mike's point, I think we need more consistency, and especially with, I mean, something like ADUs, when you say why aren't the other municipalities doing it, it's that fear of change and fear of the current residents not liking it. And so it's a political decision more than anything, because there's no reason not to move ahead with it. I think Windsor was one of the first to approve it once the province opened it up. And for us, it's a no-brainer that it unlocks the type of density and the type of intensification that can happen, and happen with usually private ownership and private dollars, because they own the property, they own the land, and they want to extend maybe their home that they're currently living in.
Dallas, do you want to jump in on EDUs or any piece of that from your perspective?
Yeah, sure. I will quickly. I mean, I think EDUs are a really important tool in the toolbox, and we need all the tools that we have on offer. So, I appreciate the comments of others. I would maybe just put a bit of a pin in the affordability conversation as it relates to ADUs, because they're really not a secure form of affordable housing, right? So, a garden suite is built, it's rented at a relatively affordable rate. That's great. 5 years later, that home is sold. The new homeowner decides to, reformat that into a backyard. So, it's not secure housing. It's maybe affordable, maybe not. Again, I think it's one tool, but we just have to be really cognizant of what it means from a housing affordability and security perspective, because it's probably not the long-term plan that we want it to be.
Michael, I don't know if there's any piece you want to pick up there, and in particular thinking about some of the conversation that we'll shift to in the next couple of days about not only who's consulted, but who's actually active in the housing industry, and whether ADUs are something. Whether I don't know, I can't remember if the Black planners spoke about ADUs in their response at all, or if you have thoughts about sort of the extent to which the constituency that the Black planners represent are sort of picking up on this tool, or there are ways in which they could be better incentivized to use the tools like ADUs that are being put into municipal legislation.
Yeah, no, nothing really to add there, but I think that, this is, one of the situations where, the province can step in, and rather than amending the Planning Act to permit some sort of housing, is rather to require it. Having, the Planning Act say that municipalities shall provide such and such form of housing. And that sort of, helps to take the burden off the municipalities back in terms of, the opposition that may come from NIMBYs, we can talk a little bit about inclusionary zoning, for example, where I guess the City of Toronto is the only municipality so far to move forward with implementing an inclusionary zoning bylaw, where certain amounts of affordable housing are required in certain types of development. It's the bylaw passed in the City of Toronto, certainly not without controversy. I think that generally most people can get behind its purpose and intent. Whether or not the municipality should have stepped in with providing some sort of incentives to reduce the burden on private developers to shoulder the cost of providing that affordable housing, I think is probably where the conversation goes. But that's an example of where the province has come in and enabled a municipality to move forward with something that can hopefully, well, depending on, again, how it's implemented and how it's done, provide for some affordable housing that's to be secured for 99 years. So that's what I've got to say on that.
Good. Thank you. Just looking at the questions again, I want to just I think we've spent a fair bit of time talking about consultation, but I just want to note Jess Macasset's Bondi's comment there. Jess is the lead with Activate Transit Windsor Essex, a fairly new organization that is looking to represent the voices of many who are often unrepresented on transit advocacy in Windsor. But just, I think a lot of similar considerations coming in there in terms of the representation of voices. And she gives an example there in the chat or in the questions for anyone who is interested. I want to go to a question here from Jack Ramieri, and this is a question I think we can't avoid. It's a tricky one, and one that I don't want us to sort of go too far down the road on perhaps in this context, but for many of us sitting in communities outside of the GTA, I think these are some tensions that we also are having to address. And he's asking about speculators driving demand and encouraging higher prices, and says specifically in Windsor, where he practices real estate law, his position is that 50% of his residential sale transactions right now involve buyers from the GTA, which then, of course, as he says, drives the market up for those in the local market looking for housing for themselves. So I think this is certainly the tension that's running through much of what we're seeing in terms of housing as a home versus housing as an asset. Anyone want to comment on any of that?
Yeah, I'll take that. And we certainly, I kind of presented some sort of details on that in my presentation. And I think we have to deal with the speculation issue in two ways. That one, we have to deal with it as an issue. And yes, it is absolutely happening. Sometimes it's people from the GTA, sometimes it's others, sometimes it's locals. But we have to also ask sort of why is it happening? And it's a combination of two factors. That the first is things that we can't really do about, globally low interest rates, high savings rates. Those parts of it aren't, anything that we can really control that much. But the second one is the fact that, as speculation thrives in an environment of scarcity, right? That scarcity drives speculation. So I do think we need to have policies more at the federal level to deal with speculation, but we also have to realize that is largely only dealing with some of the symptoms, and we need to deal with the underlying causes. And it's the reason why that, we've seen some, because the speculation exists everywhere, but, we see very big differentials between price increases in some markets than others. And what differentiates that is the underlying level of scarcity of housing. So yes, it exists. Yes, it's a problem, and we need to deal with both the direct problem, but we also need to deal with the underlying causes that are driving the speculation in the first place.
Right, thanks, Mike. Anyone else on the panel want to jump in on that one?
I will. I think, I think this is almost somewhat of an existential question. Do we want to allow the uber commodification of housing? Because it's one thing to say, I think one of the statistics that Mike presented was that some of the people who are buying a second home in somewhere in the country, like Bob Cajun, aren't selling their local home in Toronto. And that's, something where somebody is stretching their asset to cover two and to allow for something like that. But then there's an entirely different thing. And we've learned it from, we had a speaker here in Windsor, Leilani Fari, that basically, did a film about it, talking about the commodification of housing and how international corporations are coming in and buying housing and then making it a commodity. And also even to the extent that retirement plans are investing in these large corporations that have made housing a commodity. And I think the biggest impact here is on renters, because the rental market, you've seen people come in, buy the buildings, slowly evict people, and then jump the rents up because of the scarcity of housing. So to Mike's point, yes, we need to move on building these houses and we need to move on doing those things, but we also need some sort of harness on control, because the out of control rates, in Windsor, we're seeing rates that are far above the national average month over month. The median house sale price in a matter of a couple of months went up over $100,000 here. That's not happening because our population is growing that fast. That's happening because outside investors are buying the homes that locals would want to buy, and that drives the market as well. And so the issue needs federal regulation, whether that's a taxation system, whether it's something to impose a tax on non-primary residences, and it goes higher, the number of units that you have, so as to not penalize individuals who want to have a second home investment or a duplex type investment. But for the companies that are coming in, multinational companies buying up tens of thousands of units across the country, and then using that as a commodity in hedge funds and development funds, those need to be taxed. And that tax needs to flow down to the municipalities who actually deal with all of the issues tied to that development and the density and those types of things and the delivery of services that we rely on.
Dallas, anything there that you want to respond to?
I mean, just to say that I think there's a number of things we need to do to tackle the commodification of housing. One of which, of course, from my perspective, is that we need to increase the share of non-market housing, right? This is housing that is not subject to the forces of financialization. So that's one key strategy, but of course there are others as well, and it takes time to build housing. So I think some of the demand side taxation pieces are important to consider, just as Reno outlined.
Okay, thank you. We're at 11:26. I'm going to do a lightning round to finish up. I'm going to give all of our panelists a moment to give a last comment on whatever they might like to. This has been a really enlightening panel for me, and I hope it has been for our audience as well, and really setting the stage for some more sort of technical and really brass tacks conversations coming, although I think we've heard some of that already today as well, which is great. I don't know who wants to jump in. Michael, maybe I'll go to you to give us a last sort of pitch. What's the thing we need to be doing from a systems perspective, given where you're sitting?
Well, I don't think it's just one thing. It's so many things, but you know, elevating the voices in the community consultation process of those who are not sitting from the comfort of their existing, owned homes. Dealing with our currently exclusionary zoning that forbids so many forms of types of development that would really go towards addressing many of these issues. And from my perspective, dealing on a daily basis with the planning approval process, it's got to be sped up. I mean, we didn't talk about that much here, but it is just one of the reasons it is the biggest for-profit developers that are building so much of the housing is because they're the only ones that can afford to be dragged through the many years long process of what it takes to build housing. And so often they're building condos and not rentals because they've got their own investment criteria and have to return a certain amount of investment or a certain amount of turn to their investors, and it's getting bogged down in these planning approval processes that just is a killer to so much of the type of development that is drastically needed to address these problems. And I think that we really need to start talking about housing as a human right. And perhaps that will elevate some of the urgency in addressing what we've been calling a housing crisis for a while, but I don't think we're really treating it like a crisis.
Thanks for that. And just shout out, Reno mentioned Leilani Farha and her organization, The Shift. She's a former lecturer at Windsor Law as well, so feel beholden, but also does amazing work and on the human right to housing. So I think that's really a piece that needs much more focus. And Michael, I like the way you framed that too, because we tend to talk about the sort of speeding up piece as being separate from the inclusion piece, but actually it's a barrier to a lot of people entering the market, thinking about the cost and the time and expertise needed at the moment to enter into these approval processes. So thank you for highlighting that. Mike, do you want to go next?
Yeah, absolutely. So again, I'll reiterate the need for minimum standards by the province. I saw a question in the Q&A about population growth. We are absolutely not ready for that. We have a report called Forecast for Failure that looked at the Greater Golden Horseshoe growth plan. back in 2017, it massively underestimated population growth. We continue to do that at the provincial and municipal level. I've seen municipalities use immigration targets from the Mulroney years to try and forecast population growth. So we need to do that because that growth is coming. It's coming with the policy changes we're making, but we're also seeing, tragedies in Ukraine and increasing numbers of climate refugees. And you look at a climate map, one of the areas that is going to be least affected, or a really nice place to be during climate change, is the Great Lakes region. We're going to have to house a lot of people here. And I think that's a fantastic opportunity for us, but we need to be realistic and be able to sort of forecast how quickly the population is growing so we can create a climate-friendly, family-friendly house for everyone.
Thanks so much. And yeah, we didn't get to all the questions there, but there are some other questions in the chat, including the question of where the rental market falls in all of this. So I encourage everyone to take a look there, and hopefully some of those questions will come back in future sessions. Reno, going to give you a quick word, and then Dallas, I'm going to give you the very last word.
Thanks. And I mean, basically, the message is that, everybody points the finger at municipalities. Municipalities want to do the right thing. And a lot of people in the municipalities want to do the right thing. It's tricky because there's always the conundrum in those same areas of the city that promote the status quo. If you were to overlap a map of voter turnout, for example, in municipal elections, those promoting the status quo show up to vote. Those that do not show up to vote as readily. And so those issues become very tricky at a municipal level when municipal councilors, mayors, other elected representatives are basically needing to do something to secure their vote. And the report from the government mentioned that. And that's when the NIMBY voices actually get elevated because they get heard louder because they're in neighborhoods that come out to vote. What's ironic about all of this is those same neighborhoods that want to perpetuate the status quo, at the end of the day, cost the municipality and cost all the taxpayers more than those same neighborhoods that where you overlap the map that are denser and that also don't vote. And so there are a lot of tricky realities when we're looking at it from a municipal level, but by working with the province, by working with the federal government to set up a system that works and a system that takes into consideration all those aspects, we can actually start to see outcomes that we want that do touch upon climate, equity, all those types of things. And the municipality can play a key role. And I'm going to take 1 second to add a little a plug for tomorrow's session. Even later today, the session will be focusing on what the market wants. Tomorrow, the session in the morning will be dealing with what kind of tools do municipalities have to actually do that work to get what we need and do it properly. And what maybe tweaks need to happen provincially to allow municipalities to do that. And then the session in the afternoon will be dealing with people that are today doing and using innovative ideas to actually address some of these issues. So please tune in tomorrow for the great sessions, and again later today.
Perfect, all of that. Dallas.
Sure, thank you. I guess by way of closing remarks, I'd really just offer a reminder and a plea that in this housing conversation, which is so important, so timely, that we not lose sight of lower income and moderate income Canadians, right? These are folks who are not looking at the home price increase graph, but they're very important and need affordable and secure housing. We used to build large numbers of cooperative and nonprofit housing, and we absolutely can again. It requires significant public investment, probably a new way of flowing that investment, but we can do it. Co-ops and nonprofits are keen and willing and mission motivated. They deliver permanent, affordable, mixed income housing. And so it is my hope that we will see the next generation of both co-op and nonprofit housing constructed and acquired in the years ahead.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. Thanks to all of you and to Miranda who had to pop out. This has been a great conversation. You got a couple of hours to digest all of this, and we'll come back at 1:30 for our what the market really wants and needs. session. Thanks to everyone. Again, if you are sharing any of this in social media, which I hope you will, to keep the conversation going, please use hashtag C4C housing. Keep your comments coming to us as well so that we can keep doing the programming that suits your needs. Thank you very much, and we'll see you back at 1:30. Thanks, everyone.